I have kept a good many secrets in my time, as a man in my trade must, for a bookseller who cannot hold his tongue is a bookseller soon without authors. But of all the secrets that have ever been confided to my keeping, the sweetest and the most dangerous was this: that the most rational nobleman in England once stood in my shop and pronounced, to a lady's very face, that her own celebrated work could never have been written by a lady, and went away without the smallest suspicion that he had done so. I was there. I heard every measured word of it. And if I tell the tale now, at the far end of a long life, when all the parties to it are past being wounded by the telling, it is because I have laughed over it too long in private, and think it a pity that so excellent a joke, and so tender a history, should die with the last man who watched it begin. My name is Isabel Prentice, and in the years of which I write I kept a bookshop in a quiet court off Paternoster Row, under a sign that had wanted repainting since the old king's day, and served besides as secretary to a certain learned society for the encouragement of agriculture and the useful philosophy, a body of grave gentlemen who met of a Thursday to read one another papers upon marl and turnips and the rotation of crops, and to dine afterward with an enthusiasm that their turnips could not wholly account for. It was a good situation for a man of my temper, which was ever to observe much and to say little, and to know a great deal more than I let on. Between the counting-house and the committee-room there passed through my hands the greater part of the improving literature of the age, and I flatter myself that I could tell, at the first cut of the paper knife, whether a treatise had been written by a man who had walked his own fields, or merely by one who had read about the walking of them. Of all the works that came to me in those years, none was so justly esteemed as the volume that stood upon my shelves, under the modest title of Observations on the Drainage and Improvement of Wet Lands, together with some remarks upon the political economy of the farm, the whole set forth as by the late Mr. Merton, and offered to the public with that decent gravity which such subjects deserve. I will not weary you with the science of it, who very likely care as little for the under-draining of a clay soil as I care for the newest waltz, but I must make you understand that it was a work of the first distinction, did not merely repeat what other men had said, it saw. Where the common run of writers upon husbandry gave you rule and receipt, this book gave you a mind at work, a mind that reasoned from the fall of a hillside to the fortune of the men who tilled it, and thence to the whole quiet commerce of a nation's bread. Improving men spoke of it to one another in lowered, respectful voices. It sold steadily and long, which is more than can be said of most philosophy, and there was not, from the first page to the last, one word of truth in the name upon the title, for Mr. Merton was dead. He had been a scholar of real parts, a country gentleman of small estate and smaller purse, honest and idle in the way of learned men who love the discussing of a thing better than the doing of it, and he had died some 3 years before my tale begins, leaving behind him a great reputation and a daughter. The reputation was the more remarkable in that the greater and better part of it had been earned after he could no longer hold a pen. The daughter was the reason. Her name was Dorothea Merton, and she was, I am persuaded, the cleverest human creature I have ever had the honour to know. I do not say the cleverest woman. I have done with that qualification, and had done with it before I had known her a 12-month. She had sat at her father's elbow from a child, first as his pet and then as his hands, and at the last as his very brain, and where the good old man had gathered the facts and dreamed over them, it was she who had made them march. The observations were hers. Every proposition in them, every clean-drawn inference, every one of those grave, glancing sentences that made grown men of property nod their claret, hers, conceived in a cold parlour by the light of an economical candle, and written out fair in a hand disguised to pass for her father's own. In his life it had begun as help and become authorship, so gradually that I think he scarcely knew, at the end, which of his thoughts were his and which were the gifts of his child. At his death she had simply gone on. There was a further volume half made when he died. She finished it alone conceived a third, and brought the whole of it to me under the dead man's name, because the world would buy Mr. Merton's philosophy and would not, upon any terms, buy Miss Merton's. She was then some 7 or 8 and 20 tall, and not handsome in the way the word is commonly used, but with a countenance that I never tired of watching, for it was the most intelligent face I ever saw upon a human head, and the proudest. She was very poor. I do not use the word loosely. The little property had gone in her father's illness. She lived in 2 rooms with an old servant who would not leave her, and she got her bread and the servants by the labor of the finest understanding in the kingdom, disguised as the leavings of a dead man. She never complained of it to me but once, and that so quietly that a duller man might have missed the wound in it. "You will observe, Mr. Prentice," she said, folding a fair copy she had brought me, "that I am the only author of my acquaintance who must pray for her book's success and hope that no one ever learns she wrote it." Then she smiled that she might not be pitied, and asked me the terms. I gave her better terms than the trade would have allowed, and told the partners a fable to cover it, and counted it the honestest fraud of my career. This was the establishment, a shabby bookshop, a discreet publisher with a taste for other people's secrets, a learned society full of comfortable gentlemen, and moving behind it all like a hand behind a curtain, a proud and penniless young woman who had written a masterpiece and might own to nothing but the copying of it. Into this establishment, upon a raw morning in the March of the year, there walked the Duke of Wraxby. I knew him at once, though I had never spoken with him, for his person was much engraved and his character much talked of. Edward, Duke of Wraxby, was then a man of about 36, of a tall, spare figure and a grave, well-cut face that would have been handsome had he ever consented to be pleased. He was accounted, and justly, one of the first of the improving landlords of the age. A nobleman who drained and planted and rebuilt, who kept accounts like a merchant and read philosophy like a don, who had turned sour clay into corn upon estates where his fathers had been content to hunt over the bog. He was rational to the marrow. He distrusted enthusiasm, despised superstition, and believed, with a faith the more unshakable for being founded upon reason, that a man might arrive at the truth of any matter by the sober exercise of his understanding. He was also, though I did not learn this for some while, a lonely man, austere with himself before he was austere with others, and carrying beneath all that granite a capacity for admiration that he permitted very few things to satisfy. One of the few was the book upon my shelf. He came to the point with a directness I liked in him. He had read the observations, he told me, not once but many times. He had it half by heart. He did me the honor to suppose that I, as its publisher, might put him in the way of communicating with its author upon a matter of business of some moment. He wished, and here for the first time a warmth came into the level voice, he wished to consult Mr. Merton. He had upon his own estates a great tract of drowned and unprofitable land, some thousands of acres of it, that he was resolved to reclaim, not by rule of thumb, but upon true principles. And there was, he said, no man living whose principles he would sooner trust than the author of that book. He would spare no expense. He asked only to be brought to the man. You will conceive my difficulty. I had standing before me the one thing that could most enrich my poor friend and most surely undo her, a rich, earnest, honourable patron, hot to lay his money and his acres at the feet of an author who did not exist. I temporized as a bookseller learns to do. Mr. Merton, I said with perfect truth, was beyond consultation. The Duke's face fell into a real and creditable disappointment. But I went on, and here I own I was extemporizing over an abyss. There survived the author's daughter, a Miss Merton, who had been her father's assistant in all his later labours, who was intimately mistress of his method and his papers, and who might, if his grace pleased, undertake the correspondence, or even, under proper arrangement, the direction of the work upon the spot. I said it, and I confess my heart was in my mouth as I said it, for I was pledging her without her leave to the most perilous masquerade I could well imagine. The Duke considered this. He was too well bred to show the whole of his doubt, but a little of it escaped him. The daughter, he repeated. She served him as a copyist, you say, an amanuensis. As his right hand, your grace, said I, and left it there. It was at this juncture, by one of those strokes of chance that a novelist would blush to invent, but that the real world deals out with a straight face, that the inner door opened and Miss Merton herself came into the shop. She had brought me, as it happened, the corrected proofs of the very new edition we spoke of, and she came forward with them in her hand, in her plain dark pelisse and her mended gloves, not knowing what company she entered. I performed the introduction with what composure I could muster. His Grace the Duke of Wraxby, Miss Merton, daughter to the late author. He bowed. She curtsied, and I stood between them like a man who has lit a train of powder and cannot recollect where he has laid it. The Duke, I must do him the justice to say, was all courtesy, and more he was in his grave fashion moved. He told her, and it was plainly from the heart, what he thought of her father's book, that had taught him more than any work of his generation, that he counted its author a benefactor of his country, that he was come indeed to seek that author's help, and grieved to learn he was no more. Miss Merton received all this with a still face and lowered eyes, as a modest daughter should. But I, who knew her, saw the colour mount very faintly in her cheek at each fresh praise of the dead man for what the living woman had made, and I knew that every honeyed word of it fell on her like a blow struck through wool, muffled, but felt to the bone. And then the Duke, warming to his theme, and meaning nothing in the world but a handsome compliment to the departed, delivered himself of it. "It is 1,000 pities," he said, turning the volume in his hands, "that such a mind is lost to us." For it was a mind of the first order, Miss Merton, I do not scruple to say so to his own daughter, who will not think me extravagant. There is in this book a grasp, a severity, a power of sustained abstract reasoning that one meets but seldom in a life. I have heard it said in the coffee houses, he smiled a little, as at a folly he was too just to share, that a woman had some hand in it on the strength of I know not what softness they fancy in the descriptive passages. I need not tell you what I think of that. No, Miss Merton. Whatever grace your sex may lend to lighter letters, this, and he laid his hand flat upon the cover, as a man lays his hand upon a Bible to swear, this is no work for a lady. The female understanding, howsoever we may love and honour it, is not framed for labour of this rigour. Your excellent father might well be proud that no woman could have written a page of it. It is a man's book, from the first line to the last. I have been present at some notable silences in my day, but none to compare with the one that followed. The clock ticked. A cart went by in the court outside with a great innocent rattle. I did ne'er to look at Miss Merton, and then I did look, because I could not help it, and the memory of her face at that moment is with me still. She had gone perfectly white and perfectly composed. Not a muscle of her moved that she did not command. She had written every syllable of the man's book with her own hand. She had bled it out of her own brain in a cold room to keep herself and her old servant fed, and she stood there and heard the cleverest, the fairest, the most truth-loving man of her acquaintance assure her, with the whole weight of his reason, that no creature of her sex could have conceived one line of it, that the doing of it was of its very nature beyond her. And she inclined her head, the smallest fraction, as one acknowledging a just observation, and said, in a voice from which she had wrung every tremor, "You are very good to my father's memory, your grace." As for me, I underwent in that instant such a war of the passions as I hope never to feed upon again. I was in terror, genuine terror, that she would speak, that the pride which I could see straining behind her eyes would break its bounds and fling the truth in his teeth, and so ruin herself past mending before a duke in a public shop. And at one and the same time I was seized by a fit of hilarity so violent and so unseemly that I was obliged to turn to my shelves and feign a search among the folios, and there stand with my shoulders shaking, biting the inside of my cheek until it bled. While behind me the most rational nobleman in England explained to the author of the book he worshipped that her being was incapable of the thing she had done. I have wondered since whether any secretary of any learned society ever suffered so much in the cause of good manners in the space of a single minute. The Duke suspected nothing, and why should he? He had reasoned the matter out, and his reason was satisfied, and a man is never so blind as when he is looking straight at a thing his principles have told him cannot be there. He passed on, quite pleased with himself and with the world, to the business he had come upon. He would be greatly obliged, he said, if Miss Merton, since her father's knowledge survived in her, as a good clerk retains his master's method, would consent to assist him in the reclamation of his drowned acres, to come with a suitable companion into his county for the season, to bring her father's papers and her father's principles, and lend him the benefit of them upon the ground itself. He named a fee. It was a large fee. It was, I saw her calculate in one swift downcast flicker of the eyes, a year's bread and better. He named it as a great man names money without emphasis, as a thing of no consequence to him, and therefore he innocently supposed of no great consequence to anyone. She accepted. Of course she accepted. She accepted for the fee that stood between her and want, and she accepted, I am very sure, for something the Duke's money could not have bought at 10 times the price, for the chance to do openly, upon real land and at a great gentleman's charge, the very work she loved and might never sign, to build in earth and water what she was forbidden to build in her own name upon a page. She accepted to serve as his hired assistant, a man who had just told her to her face that she was constitutionally unfit for the thing she was about to do supremely well. And the Duke bowed over her mended glove as though she had done him a favour, which in truth she had past his uttermost imagining. When he was gone, and the shop bell had ceased its jangling, we stood a while and looked at one another, she and I. I did not trust myself to speak first. It was she who broke it, and when she did there was in her grey eyes a light that was neither tears nor quite laughter, but had the dangerous makings of both. Well, Mr. Prentice, she said, it seems I am to go into the country, and teach a duke to drain his bogs, and prove to him every day of the summer that a woman cannot do the thing she is doing under his nose. She drew on the other glove. I wonder which of us will break first. I said something, I forget what. Some cowardly, prudent publisher's thing about the fee, and discretion, and the hope that no harm would come of it. But in my heart, God forgive me, I was not hoping that no harm would come of it at all. In my heart I foresaw a great deal of trouble coming, of a slow and delicious and heart-breaking kind, and I found, to my shame and my delight, that I would not have missed the watching of it for the whole freehold of Wraxby. The county to which she went was some 90 miles from town, and I did not see the beginning of the work with my own eyes, but I had it afterward from her letters, which she wrote me weekly, in a hand no longer disguised, because there was now no one at her elbow to be deceived by it, and I had the rest from her own lips in the years that followed, when the whole affair had ripened into the sort of history that two friends may go over of a winter evening, as other people go over a play they have seen together. Between the letters and the telling I can set the thing down almost as though I had stood among the reeds myself, and indeed I have come to feel that I did stand there, so often have I walked that ground in my mind. She was lodged not at the great house, which would have been improper for a hired assistant travelling with no better chaperon than her old servant Martha, but at the agent's house upon the edge of the park, a snug square box of a place with a good parlour that was given over to her for a workroom, and it was to this parlour, on the second morning after her coming, that the Duke walked down from Wraxby with a roll of plans under his arm, and the manner of a man who has an hour to spare and means to spend it exactly. He had, I think, expected to find her copying. He had formed a picture of her, as men will, that answered to his theory, a good, careful, receptive young woman who had her father's papers by heart as a chorister has his psalms, and who would fetch and carry among them at his direction, and now and again light upon the very page he wanted. He meant to use her as one uses a well-ordered index. He was to be some weeks discovering that the index could argue. The first morning undid a part of it. He had spread his great survey upon the table, a beautiful thing, drawn to scale by a London engineer at a cost that would have kept Dorothea and Martha 12-month, and he stood over it and explained to her, with that grave courtesy he never laid aside, the plan of his campaign against the water. He would carry a main drain here, along the line the engineer had marked, straight as a Roman road down the slack of the valley, and cut his lesser drains into it upon either hand like the veins of a leaf, and said he would have the whole morass dry and sweet within 3 seasons, and bear him wheat where his grandfather had shot snipe. He asked her, more from good manners than from any hope of instruction, whether she found the scheme conformable to her father's principles. She looked at it a long while. I have often thought of her standing there, in her mended gloves, over the beautiful, expensive wrong thing, with a duke waiting, and of the 2 temptations that must have pulled at her in that moment, the safe, servile, profitable temptation to praise it and be comfortable, and the other, the deep, incurable temptation of the truth, which was the master passion of her life, and had already cost her more than she could well afford. She yielded, as she always yielded, to the second. She asked him, would he tell her the fall of the land between this point and that, the true fall by the level, not by the eye. He said he believed it was some 11 feet. She said then his main drain, run as the engineer had run it, would be carrying water uphill for the better part of a furlong before ever it reached the outfall, and would silt to the brim in a winter and stand as stagnant as the bog it was meant to cure, and that the fault was not in the principle but in the levels, which had been taken, she would venture to say, in a dry season and in a hurry. And she took up a pencil, his pencil, for she had brought none, being there to advise and not to draw, and upon the margin of the engineer's beautiful plan she sketched, in a few strokes, where the true line must go, curving with the land as water insists upon curving, gathering the fall instead of fighting it. He was, she told me, perfectly silent for the space of a minute, and then he did the thing that first made her think there might be more in him than his pronouncement in my shop had promised. He did not bluster, and he did not condescend. A lesser man, and a prouder in the common way, would have defended his engineer, or his 11 feet, or the mere dignity of having been about to be wrong before a hired young woman, and she had braced herself, she owned, for exactly that, and had already the taste of the next fortnight's grudging arguments in her mouth. Instead he bent over the margin and studied her few strokes with the whole force of his attention, tracing the curve she had drawn with the tip of one finger, as though he would feel the fall of the land through the paper. And then he went to the window and stood a long time looking out at the actual valley, the real water lying grey among the real rushes under a low March sky, and back again to the paper, and once more to the window, checking the one against the other with a patience that had nothing of vanity left in it. And at last he said, quietly, as a man states a fact that costs him something and pays it without complaint, "You are right. The eye deceives where the level does not, and I have trusted the eye. I have been about to spend £4,000 upon a ditch that would have shamed me, and shamed the book that taught me better. Where did you learn to read a fall of land like that?" "Of my father, your grace," she said. It was the answer she had schooled herself to give, and she gave it that morning without a tremor, for she had not yet learned how much it would come to cost her to keep giving it. It was true, too, after a fashion, which was what made it bearable and what made it terrible. For she had learned to read a fall of land at her father's side, in the years when they'd walked the wet fields of their own poor parish together, and he had shown her how the ground told its story to the patient eye. But it was she who had gone on reading when the ground grew harder and the passages longer than the good old man had patience for, she who had taken the trick of it and made of it an art past anything he had owned, and to lay the whole of it at his feet, as though she were but the vessel of his teaching and had added nothing of her own, was to rob herself in the very act of being praised, and to do it with a smile, and to say thank you afterward. "Your father," said the Duke, "taught you more than most fathers teach their sons," and he meant it wholly for a compliment to the dead, and never saw the living woman flinch under it, or if he saw, he rid the flinch as modesty. From that hour, though, he treated her differently, not as an equal. Understand, I do not want to make him better at a stroke than he was, for the whole sorrow and comedy of the thing lay precisely in his not seeing, but he treated her as a superior instrument than he had bargained for, a tool of unlooked-for temper, and he began, without in the least meaning to talk to her as a man talks to another man whose judgment he has come to want. They fell into a way of working that was, upon its surface, the most correct thing imaginable, and underneath it the most dangerous. Each morning he came down to the parlour, or sent for her up to the estate room at the great house, when then there were ledgers to be consulted that could not travel, and there they bent together over the survey and the level book and the long columns of the reclamation accounts, and fought the campaign out inch by inch upon the paper before ever a spade was set in the ground. And I must make you understand, for it is the heart of the whole matter, that this was to both of them a species of joy that neither had a name for and neither dared confess. He had been, for all his rank and all his acres, a profoundly solitary man. He had lost his wife young, I afterward learned, within 2 years of a marriage made for suitable reasons and never warmed by anything the heart could recognize. He had no one about him who did not depend upon him, no one who would tell him he was wrong, no friend of his understanding within a day's ride. He had improved his estates the way another man drinks to fill a silence, and here of a sudden was a mind that met his own at the full stretch of its powers and did not give way. that caught his meaning before he had done uttering it, that carried his own thought further than he had carried it and handed it back to him enlarged, that told him he was wrong to his face and was oftener right than he. He did not know he was lonely until he began, those mornings, to be less so. And she was doing the work she loved, upon a scale she had never dreamed of commanding, with an inexhaustible purse behind her and a great tract of the earth itself for her page. Consider what that was to her, who had made her masterpiece in 2 hired rooms by the light of a candle she must not burn too long, and reckon the cost of every quire of paper against the cost of the week's coals. Here there was no reckoning. If a thing wanted trying, it was tried. If a level wanted taking again, the men were sent out to take it. The whole apparatus of a great fortune stood ready at her word, though the word must go out in the Duke's name, or in her father's, and never in her own. She had spent her life building in the small. Now she built in the large, in earth and water and running lines of drain that would outlast her by a century, and that the pleasure of it went to her head like wine. And she was doing it, moreover, in the company of the only person she had ever met, my own poor self excepted, who cared for the thing as she cared for it and could follow her to the top of her flight. She told me once, long after, that those months were the happiest of her life and the most wretched, and that she had never been able to sort the happiness from the wretchedness, because they came of the very same cause. To sit across a table from a man of first-rate understanding and drive a gwerk forward with him, thrust for thrust, was happiness such as she had given up expecting in this world. To sit across a table from that same man and know that he believed, with the calm certainty of a creed, that she was fundamentally incapable of the thing he watched her do every hour of the day, that he praised the fruit of her brain in a dead man's name, and would have laid down his good opinion of her the instant he learned the truth, that was the wretchedness. And it sat at the same table, in the same chair, wearing the same grave courteous face that she was, God help her, beginning to watch for at the window each morning, but she well knew that she watched for it, for the peril was not all of the mind, though it wore the mind's dress. I saw it in her letters before, I think, she saw it in herself. She wrote to me of the work, always of the work, of the outfall they had at last agreed upon, of the trouble with a tenant who would not have his old rushy common touched, of the ingenious kiln the Duke had built to burn his own draining tiles, of a wet fortnight that undid a month's ditching. But there began to be, threaded through the plans and the levels, the Duke himself, what the Duke had said, how the Duke had looked when the first cut ran clear. A dry joke of the Duke's that she set down for me because it had made her laugh, and then, in the next letter, a defence of the Duke against some slighting thing I had ventured in reply, a defence a shade warmer than his character strictly required. He was not, she informed me, the cold man his manner gave out. He was only a man who had been given no occasion to be otherwise. I read that sentence twice, I remember, and laid the letter down and said aloud to my empty shop, "Oh, my dear. Oh, my dear girl, for I have sold a great many novels in my time, and I knew the shape of the thing coming, though she did not, and I knew, too, upon what a reef it must strike, because the man who was winning her, gently and without the least idea that he did it, was the same man who had told her to her face that her sex could not think. The strain of it showed first, and worst, in the small unbearable moments when his prejudice and her disguise ran full against one another, and she must stand and take it. There was a day, she gave me the whole of it, for it had scored her, when a neighbouring baronet rode over to see the great works, a fox-hunting, port-drinking, good-natured blockhead of the old school, and stood at the head of the new main drain watching the brown water run off down it in a satisfying rope, and said, jerking his chin at Dorothea where she stood a little apart with her level book, "And who's this, Wraxby? Never tell me you've took to petticoat engineers." And the Duke, who was, I do believe, upon the very point of some real generosity, some acknowledgment of how much the daughter herself had put into the work, the Duke laughed easily among men and said, "This is Miss Merton, who does me the great service of interpreting her late father's principles. She has his papers, you know, and a very fair understanding of his method. As much of it, I dare say, as a careful pupil may retain. As much of it as a careful pupil may retain. She had conceived the outfall they were standing over. She had saved him his £4,000 and his good name with it. She had that morning corrected a computation of his own that would have thrown his levels out by a foot, and she stood and heard herself given out, to a fool who could not have drained a wash-hand basin, as her dead father's retentive pupil, and she smiled, and said nothing, and wrote down the reading in her book with her hand. She told me that she had to hold by main force to keep from driving the pencil through the paper. Yet even her anger was a snare, for it was not the clean cold anger she could have felt for a stupid man. She could have despised the baronet and forgotten him by dinner. What she could not despise, and could not forget, was that the Duke had said it without malice and without lie. He believed it. He was not flattering the dead to spite the living. He was simply reporting to a friend the honest state of his mind, and that honest state of his mind was a wall built clean across her life, and she had fallen, she was beginning to be horribly aware, to loving the mason who had built it, and did not know he had shut her out. I could bear it, she wrote to me that week, if he were a mean man, or a stupid one, or a man who slighted me from some smallness in himself, then I might hate him and be at peace. It is that he is none of these, that he is just and generous and loves the truth as I love it, and has arrived by pure reason at a falsehood about half the human race and does not dream it is a falsehood, and that he pays my father every day in the coin I have starved for, the honest homage of the best man I know. Tell me, Mr. Prentice, for you are wiser in the world than I, what is a woman to do, who has fallen to prizing the good opinion of the one man on earth she can never, while she keeps her secret, deserve it from, and can never, if she breaks it, keep? I had no answer for her. I have it still less now, at the end, when I know how the story went. For the story went better than either of us could then have dared to hope. But she did not know that, writing by her economical candle in the agent's parlour, and I did not know it, reading in my shop. And between us we knew only that the trap was shut and the two of them fast in it together, and that every good and admirable thing about the man was another turn upon the spring. She was to spend the summer proving, hour by hour, that a woman could do the work he said no woman could do, and taking his praise of her father like slow poison and warming, against all her will and all her judgment, to the giver of it. I wrote back the prudent, useless, affectionate things a friend writes, and I confess that when I had sealed the letter I sat a long time over my cold hearth, no longer laughing at all, and thought that I had let my dear proud girl walk open-eyed into the one country from which there is no retreat without a wound, and that all I could do, being only a bookseller, was to keep the secret, and keep the faith, and wait to see which of them, as she had said in my shop on that raw March morning, would break first. The summer came on, and with it the true trial of the work, for it is one thing to draw a drain upon a fair sheet of paper in a warm room, and quite another to make the sullen earth consent to it. All through the green weeks of May and into the heavy heats of June the campaign went forward upon the ground, and Dorothea was upon the ground with it, from a little after sunrise most days until the light failed. In a stout pair of country boots she had bought out of the first quarter of her fee, and a broad straw hat that Martha declared made her look like a dairymaid, and that she wore, she told me, for precisely that reason, since a dairymaid at least was permitted to be useful in the open air without a scandal. She walked the lines with the Duke and his bailiff. She stood in the raw cuts with the water sucking at her boots and read the fall off her levelling staff with her own eye, because she had ceased to trust any eye but hers. She came home at evening splashed to the knee and burned across the nose, and happier, she confessed, than she had any business to be, and the Duke walked every yard of it at her side. It was in the field that the thing between them ripened, faster than either would have let it ripen indoors, for the field would not stand upon ceremony. There was a morning in the first week of June that she set down for me at length, because it was, she said, the day she stopped pretending to herself that she came out only for the work they had struck in carrying the great main drain across the lowest of the meadows, upon a thing that was not in any plan, a broad soft belt of black quaking ground, a running quicksand of the fens, that swallowed the spoil as fast as the men could throw it out, and threatened to swallow the drain itself the moment it was cut. The bailiff was for going round it. The engineer's line, had they still been keeping to it, would have taken them clean through the middle and lost them the summer. And the Duke stood at the lip of the black stuff with his brows drawn down, and that look upon him, she said, of a man wrestling a thing by main force of will and getting nowhere, which was the look he wore when his reason had come to the end of its road and would not admit it. She got down, careless of her hem, and thrust her staff into the ooze, and again a yard further on, and again, sounding it as a waterman sounds a channel, and she found what she had guessed she might find, that the soft belt was not deep, but lay like a skin over firmer marl, and that a man might float a road across it if he would not fight it but spread his weight upon it, as one crosses thin ice not by treading harder but by lying down. She had read of the thing, the laying of a raft of faggots and brushwood beneath the bank to carry it over the soft place. She had never seen it done, and she stood in the mud and reasoned it out aloud to him, the whole of it, the bearing of the brush and the depth of the marl and the pitch they must give the sides, while the Duke listened with his head bent to her as a man bends to callow voice in a wind. And when she had done he did not say, this time, "Where did you learn it?" He said only, "We will try it," and turned and gave the orders in the same breath, and stripped off his own coat and had the first faggot laid with his own hands. A Duke to the elbows in a bog upon the strength of a poor woman's reading, and when 3 days after, the bank ran firm and true across the place that had been a quicksand, and the water came down the new cut in a clean brown rope and away. The two of them stood and looked at it, and then looked at one another, and laughed. She told me, for no reason that either could have given to a magistrate, laughed purely out of the fellowship of a hard thing done well together, the first wholly unguarded laughter she had ever had of him. And in that moment, she wrote, I would not have changed my muddy boots for the slippers of a queen. That was the manner of their days, and you will see how it must go. Two fine minds cannot labour so, hand to hand and thought to thought, upon a work they both love, without there growing up between something for which the work is only the trellis. He came to rely upon her past all disguising. He would decide nothing latterly without her. He fell into the way of saying we, and then of not troubling to say it because it went without saying. The men on the works who miss nothing took to watching for a nod behind his word, and gave her, in their own rough grammar, a kind of authority they had no name for and would have denied if you had charged them with it. An old ditcher who had drained wet ground man and boy for 50 years fell into the way of bringing his doubts to her of a morning, cap in hand, before ever he took them to the bailiff. And she told me she prized that unlettered man's rough trust above a shelf of reviews, for he at least came to the mind and not to the name upon the spine, and she who had built all her life in secret and been thanked, when she was thanked at all, in a dead man's name. She was for the first time in her days openly needed, her judgment waited upon, her presence looked for, and if it was not her name they set to the work, it was at least her living self they turned to in the field. And that was a sweetness she had not known she hungered for until she was fed with it. But I must be honest, as she was honest with me, and set down that the sweetness was never once clean of the poison, for the same summer that taught them to love taught her, over and over, the exact dimensions of the wall between them, and the Duke laid a fresh course upon that wall almost every day, whistling, so to speak, as he built. He had got a habit, those months, of talking to her as he worked, out of the fullness of a mind that had been starved of hearers, and much of what he said was such as she treasured, for he was a man of deep reading and deeper thought and no fool in anything but the one thing. But let the talk come round, as upon that ground it must, to the book, to her book, and he would deliver himself, in the kindest voice in the world, of some judgment that went through her like a skewer. Your father, he said to her one evening, folding away a computation she had just set right for him, the rarest of all the gifts of the understanding, Miss Merton. He could hold a long chain of reasoning entire in his mind and never drop a link. It is a masculine power in its perfection. I say nothing against your sex, who have graces we are the better for, but this particular strength, this architecture of the reason, nature has given to the man. Your father was proud of you, I do not doubt, and taught you well. But it must have been a grief to him at the last that he had no son to leave the whole of it to. And she, who had held that very chain of reasoning entire in her mind not 10 minutes since, and mended the link that he had dropped, said, I believe he was reconciled to it. Your Grace, and bent her burning face over the level book. She told me she used to lie awake and take a kind of dreadful inventory of these sayings, turning them over one by one in the dark. He had told her that the descriptive passages of the book, the very passages the reviewers had most praised, and that she had wept over writing, in the winter her father died, were plainly the softer work of the daughter's hand upon the father's iron, a little colour, laid on by the good girl who copied for him. He had told her that a woman's wit was like a fine sword, admirable for a flash and a thrust, but that it wanted the weight of the man's for the long hewing labour of a great argument. He had told her, meaning it for the highest compliment he owned, that she had very nearly a man's clearness of head, very nearly, and had looked pleased with himself for saying it, and she had thanked him. There was even a day he had condescended, kindly, to explain to her the very principle of the tapered outfall, her own principle, the one she had drawn upon his engineer's plan in March, as one explains a hard matter to a bright child, watching her face to see that she followed, and she had followed, and nodded, and asked one foolish question on purpose that he might have the pleasure of answering it, and had gone home and been sick at heart the whole evening for the meanness she had put upon herself to spare him. Every one of these was a coal upon her, and she gathered them all, and lay upon them, and would not for the world have shown him the burn, for what could she have said? To answer him truly was to end everything in an hour, her employment, her secret, the book itself, the good bread it earned, and she was beginning to understand these long days at his side that she had come to reckon the wealth of her life. So she kept the truth as a woman keeps her hand off a wound in company, that no one may see it bleed, and she watched him, and loved him the more for the very justice and warmth that made his blindness so complete, and hated herself for the loving, and could not stop. There was one evening above the rest that she gave me whole, and I will set it down as she gave it, for it was, I have always thought, the hinge of the whole business, the hour after which there was no going back for either of them, though neither said a word that a bishop might not have heard. They had walked out late, the two of them and no one by, to look at the great drain where it came at last to its outfall in the river, the outfall she had chosen, over the engineers in the parlour in March, and they came to it as the sun was going down behind the far rise, and stood upon the new bank and watched the water of a whole drowned valley go sliding out clean and steady into the stream, the labour of the spring made visible and running before their eyes. It was the first evening the thing could be said to be truly working. The snipe were calling over the flats that would bear corn within 3 seasons. The light lay along the water like beaten copper, and the Duke, who had said very little as they walked, stood bareheaded in it and looked at what they had made, and Dorothea looked at him, and neither for a while spoke at all. Then he began to talk low, not quite to her, as a reserved man will talk once in a 12-month when the beauty of a thing has unlocked him. He spoke of what the valley would be when they were both dust, of the men who would get their living off it and never know his name nor care, and of how that was as it should be, for the land outlasts the Lord. He spoke, without at all meaning to, of his loneliness, of the great empty house behind them and the long correct years of it, of a marriage he had made because it was fitting and that had left him, when it ended, with no more grief than a man feels at the closing of a house he never cared to live in, and a shame at feeling so little. He said he had thought, until this spring, that he was a man who did not much need the company of his own kind, and that he had lately begun to think he had been wrong, and had only never met the company that suited him. And here he stopped, as a man stops at the edge of a thing he has not license to say, and there fell between them a silence so full that she said she could hear her own heart in it, and the running of the water, and nothing else in the world. She knew, in that silence, past any more pretending, that she loved him, and she knew, which was worse, that he was upon the very brink of knowing that he loved her, and she knew, third and coldest, that if he once said it she must either lie to him with her whole life, or tell him the truth and watch his face change, watch the just reasoning, honourable man discover that the mind he had opened his own to was a woman's after all, and the book his idol a fraud, and his hired assistant a deceiver who had sat at his table all summer and let him worship a lie. And so she did the bravest and the most wretched thing of that whole wretched summer. She stepped back from the brink for both of them. She said, in a light, steady voice that cost her, "She told me, more than any silence, the valley does you great credit, your grace. My father would have been proud to see it." She said my father of all the names on earth on purpose into that moment as one throws cold water, and she watched him hear it and gather himself and step back too, the color of the copper light going out of the moment as the sun went off the water. And he answered gravely, courteously, a little coldly even, that the credit was in great part her father's, and hers for keeping his method so faithfully, and they turned and walked home in the dusk a careful yard apart, talking of the price of tiles. I had it from her the following week, that letter, and I have it yet, and the ink is bad in one place where I think a drop fell on it that was not ink. I might have let him speak, she wrote. God forgive me, for the space of one breath I wished to let him speak, and take what came, and be an honest woman to him for 1 minute of my life, whatever it cost after. And then I thought, what is it he would be speaking to? Not to me. To a picture he has made, his Merton's clever daughter, the good pupil, the sword flash of a wit that he can love because he believes it harmless and lesser and no rival to his own. The moment he knew the truth of me, he would take the words back and be right to by his own creed, for the very thing I am is the thing he has sworn a woman cannot be, and it is not the false Dorothea he would repudiate but the true one, the one that wrote his book. He loves what is not I, and could not love what is. So I stopped his mouth with my dead father's name, and came home, and here I sit, Mr. Prentice, the most fortunate wretch in England, loved by the best man I know for being a woman small enough to be loved by him, and unable to be that woman, and unable to be any other, and unable to tell which grief is the sharper, that he does not know me, or that if he did he would go. I read that, and I did not laugh, though there had been a time that summer I could still laugh at the comedy of it. I saw that the comedy had grown a second face, as such things will, and that the two of them were now fast in a place where every step toward happiness was a step toward ruin, and every honest word a knife. They loved each other. Of that, after that evening on the bank, there could be no more doubt in her mind, or, I came to think, in his, for all that neither had said the word, and the love, so far from opening a door, had only shown them both how thick the wall was and how high. He could not speak, for his honor and her station and his own cold certainty that stood, though he knew it not, squarely across the only ground where they could ever have met as equals. She could not speak for her secret, which his very love now made 1,000 times more dangerous to tell, for a lie between strangers is a small thing beside a lie between two who have come to love, and so the summer that had begun in the joy of a shared work went on into a high, still, unbearable summer of the heart, in which they were nearer to one another every day and further from any hope of it, and the secret that had been a mischief in March lay upon them both now like a stone upon a grave, hers the deceit, his the blindness, and neither able to lift it without burying what they most wished to keep. I wrote back the little I could, and waited, for I knew as she knew that a thing wound so tight does not stay wound, and that somewhere down the bright ruined summer the spring must fly. The spring flew, as I had told her it must, though not in the manner either of us had feared, and it was the very success of the work that sprung it, for the drained valley did not keep its own counsel, as a private grief may. Water that runs clean where it ran foul is a thing seen a long way off, and talked of, and by the end of that summer the Duke of Wraxby's improvement was be small fame in the county and past the county, and gentlemen with wet acres of their own began to write, and then to come, driving out along the new hard roads to stand upon the new banks and marvel and take notes. Behind them presently came a graver sort of interest from the sort of men who do not marvel but examine. There was a society in the town. I will not name it more particularly than to say it was a learned and improving body, much given to the reading of papers and the awarding of medals, and that the Duke was a fellow of it and set great store by it, which now desired, having heard of what had been done upon his ground, that the thing should be brought before it in form, that the method should be laid open, the principles stated, the whole reduced to a paper that abler men might weigh and, if it stood, commend to the nation, and the Duke, glowing with the justice of it, resolved that this honour should fall where he in all conscience believed it belonged, not upon himself, who had but paid for the ditching, but upon the mind that had drawn the method, upon Mr. Merton and the great book, and the good faithful daughter who had carried her father's science into the field and proved it in the mud. You will see the trap of it at once, as she saw it, Reading his kind letter across the parlor table with a face, she told me that she had to hold in place by main force as one holds a door against a wind. He would have the author honored. He would have Mr. Merton's method read to the society under Mr. Merton's name, with a full and generous account of how it had been applied, and since Mr. Merton was dead, and could not come to be crowned, he pressed it upon her as a delicacy, a thing he had thought long about how to offer without wounding her modesty, that Miss Merton should furnish him the particulars, the calculations, the very draughts in the author's hand, that the paper might be built true, and that she should permit him, further, to name her in it, publicly and with honor, as the keeper and executor of her father's genius. He had even, he wrote, taken the liberty of sounding the secretary of the society as to whether a lady might be admitted to hear the paper read, it being so nearly her own concern, and had carried the point, and was pleased as a boy to be able to tell her so. She sat with the letter a long while, she said, and then she went out and walked the whole length of the new drain and back in the dusk, alone, and came in and wrote to me by candle a single wild page that I keep with the rest. It is come, she wrote. The thing I have run before all summer has run me down at last. He would have the author honored, and I am the author, and he does not know it, and every honor he heaps upon the dead man is a stone laid upon the living woman. He asks for the draughts in my father's hand. There are none. There never were any. There is only my hand, which I have learned to counterfeit into a stiffer, older fist for the copying, and which no examining eye at a learned society will take for a dead scholar's if once it is looked at hard. He would name me in his paper as the copyist, the keeper, the good girl who dusted the great man's desk, and set the true account of me, in my own despite, into print over his own honourable signature, before a room full of the only men in England who might one day guess. I cannot furnish what he asks and be safe. I cannot refuse what he asks and not be strange, and I cannot for my life see the road out of it. And then, lower on the page, in that bad ink, and the worst is not the danger. The worst is that he does it for love of me, and calls it honouring my father, and I must fight him off from the very truth he would most rejoice to know, if only he were another man than he is. For there was the whole of it, and it came to its head, as saints do, not in the crisis she had dreaded, but in an idle hour before it, over nothing at all. I have the scene as she gave it to me, and I set it down nearly whole, for it was the hour the ground gave way beneath them, and after it there was no more level standing for either. They were in the library of the great house of a wet afternoon, drawing off between them the first rough heads of the very paper, for she had not found the courage yet to refuse, and had let herself be drawn into the making of it, telling herself she did but guide his pen. He was in high good humour, the fire going, the rain on the tall windows, and he was happier, she said, than she had ever seen him, because he had before him at once the two things he most prized, a fine work to set out in order, and her across the table to set it out with. And as they worked he fell to talking, in that unbuttoned, confiding way the labour of the summer had taught him with her, of what the paper would do, and of the notice it would draw, and from that, by the natural drift of a man's easy talk, to the general matter of authorship and reputation and the strange traffic of fame, and so, all unknowing, with a smile on his face and his pen turning idle in his fingers, he walked straight out upon the ice over the deepest water in the world and never felt it bend. For he began to speak of women who wrote. There had been, it seemed, some talk of it lately in the town. A lady had published a thing, a novel or a treatise, I forget which she said, under her own name and been much discussed, and had stirred the Duke to opinion, as such things stir men who have thought little and settled much. He set down his pen, she said, and leaned back and delivered himself, in the mild reasonable voice of a man stating what all sensible persons must own, of his whole mind upon the question, and because he was among friends, as he thought, and speaking to the one companion of his understanding. He spoke it without the smallest guard, in the fullness of his ignorance and the warmth of his ease, to the one creature living whom every word of it flayed. He said that he would not, for his part, ever be brought to believe that a woman had written any work of the first rank of the reason, not the poetry he allowed, nor the lighter graces, in which the sex might even excel, but the hard architectural work, the long-hewn argument, the sustained and passionless labour of the understanding. Where such a thing appeared under a woman's name, he said, a man of sense would do well to look for the father, or the brother, or the husband behind the curtain. But that was not the half of what he said, nor the cruel half. For he went on gently, gently, as one deplores a sad necessity of nature, to say that where such a mind did truly appear in a woman, in the rare freak of the thing, it was no cause for envy but for a kind of pity, for the woman who had it was a woman spoiled. It is not that they cannot, here and there, he said. It is that they should not, and that the doing unsexes them. A woman made learned in that hard way is a thing gone wrong, Miss Merton, a garden run to timber. She has bought the one power at the cost of all the graces it was her whole business to keep. I have met one or two such in London, your prodigies, your female philosophers, and I give you my word I came away each time chilled to the bone. One may admire them as one admires as a well-made engine. One cannot love them, one cannot esteem them as women, for they have unwomaned themselves, and no man of feeling, whatever he may say in their drawing-rooms, would take such a one to wife and warm his life at that cold, clever fire. And then, this was the stroke, she said. This was the blade into the hilt. He turned to her with the kindest face in the world, warming to his compliment, and said, "It is why I have valued this summer as I have, and your company in it above any I ever kept. For here are you, with a better head than half the men I sit in society with. And yet no blue stocking, no unsexed thing, no rival to any man, a woman clean through. Your father's helped me to never his competitor, carrying his science as a daughter carries her father's name, in love and not in vanity. You have all of the understanding that becomes a woman, and not one grain of the sort that spoils her. That is a rare and a lovely thing, Miss Merton, and rarer for being, I think, quite unconscious of itself, and I would not have you altered by a hair." She sat very still, she told me. The rain went on at the windows. He had paid her, by his own lights, the highest and tenderest compliment he had it in him to pay a living woman, and he sat there pleased and gentle, and awaiting nothing worse than her blush, and she understood in that one long moment, with a completeness that she said was almost restful, like the cold that comes after a great pain, the whole hopeless shape of her life, the book that he honoured, she had written it, the mind he pitied and shuddered at, the timber, the engine, the cold, cold clear fire, the thing gone wrong, was hers, was her very self, was the one glory and truth of her, and it was that self, precisely that and no other, which he had just sawn before her, that no man of feeling could love or esteem, and which he thanked God she was not. He loved her, she now saw past all mistaking, exactly and only because he believed her to be the opposite of what she was. His love and her truth were not two things that stood a little apart and might be brought together with patience. They were two things that could not both be in the world at once. The moment he knew the true Dorothea, in that same moment the woman he loved would cease to have existed, would be shown never to have existed, and in her place would stand the very creature he had described with a shudder, the unsexed prodigy, the deceiver moreover who had sat at his fire all summer and let him pour out his heart to a mask. To tell him the truth was not to risk his love, it was to make his love, by his own solemn creed, impossible, and to forfeit his respect in the same breath and by the same act. She could keep his heart only so long as she withheld herself from it. She could give herself only at the price of both. "I did not weep," she wrote to me, which surprised me. I said, "You are severe upon my sex, your grace," in a voice I did not know for mine, and he laughed and said he was the truest friend my sex had, since he asked of it only that it be itself. And I got up and said the light was failing and I must go, though it was scarce 4 o'clock, and I came away. "Mr. Prentice, I have been a fool all summer. I told myself the wall between us was his ignorance, and that ignorance might mend. It is not ignorance. It is his creed, held in cold blood by the best and justest reason I ever met, and it is aimed at the marrow of me. He does not merely fail to see what I am. He has considered what I am in the abstract, and pronounced it a thing gone wrong, a thing no man of feeling can love, and then in the same hour told me he loves me because I am not it. I cannot mend that by revealing myself. I can only prove myself to the man I love, the very monster he has just described, and I find that I would rather he loved a fiction to the end of his days than that he should look at the truth of me with the face he wore this afternoon when he spoke of the cold, clever fire." And so she began from that wet afternoon to withdraw, and it is the withdrawing that I must chronicle now, for it is the sorrowful business of this part of her story. She would not go on. That was the resolve she reached in the days after, and she reached it, I think, as much out of pride as out of prudence, and I will not blame her for the pride, for it was the last thing of her own she had left. She would not stand up in a room full of learned men and hear her own book praised over a dead man's name, while the one man she loved beamed at her for a modest copyist. She would not furnish the draughts and forge the science of herself into a stiffer hand to fool the examiners, and be honoured as her father's servant to the Duke's applause. She would not, above all, go on being loved as a fiction, warming herself at a fire she knew to be lit for someone who did not exist, for she found, she said, that having once seen it plain she could not unsee it, and that every kind word he now gave her fell on her like a word given to another woman in her hearing. So she wrote to the Duke, civilly and with a coldness she manufactured at great cost, that upon consideration she doubted her father's method was ripe to be laid before so grave a body, that she feared to see his memory hazarded upon the judgment of strangers, that she thought the paper had best be laid by, and indeed, that her own part in the works, her father's science being now proved and the main labour done, might fittingly be drawing to its close, since she had a living to think of and could not always be a guest upon his charity. She read it over, she told me, and thought it a very creditable piece of lying, and sent it, and was sick after. The Duke was struck to the quick, and did not understand, and not understanding, did the thing that widened the breach past mending for that season. For a proud man wounded where he has been tender casts about him for the cause, and lights first upon the nearest and the wrongest. And he could make nothing of her sudden coldness, but that he had presumed too far, that his half-spoken warmth upon the bank, and this new closeness of the paper, had frightened a poor gentlewoman conscious of her station, and that she was drawing back to teach him his distance. That galled him where he was proudest. He wrote in return a letter she showed me, and it was a dreadful letter for all its perfect courtesy, stiff as a poker from the first line, thanking her coldly for her scruples on her father's behalf, accepting her withdrawal from the works without a word of the summer, and regretting this was the sentence that cut her, she said, because it was so plainly meant to cut that he had perhaps mistaken, in the freedom of a shared labour, the terms upon which a lady in her situation could be easy, and would not so err again. He had thought her, the letter as good as said, above the small pride of her sex, and found her not above it after all, and there was in the very hurt of it, she saw with a bitter clearness, a fresh dawning of that same first suspicion he could not name, a puzzlement, cased in ice, at a woman who could be at once so able, and so unaccountable, so nearly a man in her head, and so wholly and vexingly a woman in her conduct. He did not know what she was. He was further from knowing it than ever, and more troubled by the not knowing, and he retreated behind his rank and his rule as she retreated behind her secret, and the two of them, who a week before had laughed together over a beaten quicksand, now stood off from one another across a silence, each nursing a wound the other had no notion of having given. I had both their letters within the same 3 days, hers, and the copy she made me of his, and I sat late over them in my shop with the shutters up, and no comfort in me at all, for I saw that they had come, at last, to the place I had dreaded all along without owning it, that the prejudice was no longer a mist he might walk out of, but a wall laid bare to its foundation, and that she had seen the whole height of it, and turned away rather than break herself against it, that the secret, so far from being safe in the turning away, was wound tighter than ever by the very success that would have crowned it, and that two people who loved each other past any doubting were now sundered by a thing that neither could speak, his creed, her truth, and drifting, each in wounded pride, towards some reckoning that could not now be long put off. A thing wound so tight does not stay wound. I had written that to her in the spring, thinking myself worldly. I read it back that autumn night, and did not feel worldly at all, but only afraid for the two of them, for the spring must fly, and I could not see how it should fly without wounding one or both past healing. It did not stay wound a fortnight, and it was I, God forgive me, who was made the ground it broke upon. So that of this part of the story I'm no longer only the reader of her letters, but a man who stood in the room and saw the thing done, and has not been able, in all the years since, to unsee it. for the society would not let the matter drop, as she had prayed it might. A withdrawal so sudden and so unexplained, coming just as the county rang with the works, did not quiet talk but bred it, and among the graver fellows there was one. I will not name him beyond saying he was a man of real learning and no malice, only that cold thoroughness which is a virtue until it falls upon a secret, and then is a scourge. Who took it into his head to wonder aloud why a method so novel and so complete should have lain all these years unpublished in its application, unremarked by its own author, to be brought to light last by a nobleman's ditching and vouched for by nobody but the author's daughter. He did not doubt the science. The drained valley was there for any man to walk. He doubted the man. Before the society set its medal upon Mr. Merton's book, he said, and the nation was invited to build upon it, it were only prudent that the working papers should be seen, the original computations, the draughts and trials in the author's own hand, that the world might know past cavil whose mind had done the thing. It was, of all challenges, the one against which she had no defence, for there were no such papers. There was only her hand, and a hand would betray her the instant it was laid beside a letter she had ever written, and the Duke, who might have let it go, could not. His honour was in it now doubly, for the dead man he had crowned, and for himself, who had staked his name and his societies before all England upon the book. He would not have it whispered that the Duke of Wraxby had been gulled by an impostor's treatise and a scheming daughter. He would put the doubt down as a gentleman puts down an insult, by producing the proof and flinging it upon the table, and he knew where the proof must lie. The book had a publisher. I had brought it out, years before, in the small way I bring things out, and the fair manuscript from which my men had set the type was in my keeping still, in the iron box beneath my counter, where I keep was most nearly sacred to me. So the Duke came to London, and came to my shop, without a word of warning, upon a raw November afternoon with the lamps already lit against the fog, and Dorothea was there. That was the cruelty of the arrangement, that she was there. She had come back to me when she left his county, having nowhere else and no heart for anywhere, and I had given her the little room above the shop and such work as an old bookseller can honestly find for a clever woman, the reading of proofs and the keeping of my accounts, and she had taken it without complaint and gone very quiet. And I had begun to hope the wound might scar over in obscurity as wounds will. She was at the high desk in the inner room when the bell went, mending a torn folio, and I in the front among the shelves. When the door opened upon that tall grave figure I knew from her description before ever he had crossed my sill, the fog wreathing in after him and the fine dark coat beaded with wet, and I knew the day I had dreaded for 2 years was upon me with no time to make ready for it at all. He was very courteous and very cold, and came to his business like a man who has rehearsed it to spare himself the pain of feeling it. He named himself, he named the book, he named the challenge that had been thrown down, in language that made light of it and could not quite, and he desired, if I were the publisher of it, to be shown the original manuscript, that a doubt cast upon a great man's memory might be answered as it deserved. I have thought since that I might have lied, sworn the papers lost, the box rifled, the thing burnt in a fire, and bought her another year. But I am a slow man, and he stood there with his hand out and his whole honourable soul in the asking, and while I hesitated the inner door opened, and she came out. I think she had heard his voice. I think she could no more have kept in that room with his voice in the shop than a needle can keep from the lodestone. She came out with the folio still in her hand and stood in the doorway, and he turned, and for a moment neither of them said one word, and I saw both their faces at once and have them by heart. His went, in the space of a breath, from the courteous moss through blank astonishment to a kind of light I could not read, for whatever their parting, she was the woman he loved, and he had not looked to see her, and joy leapt in him before he could govern it and was terrible to watch, because I knew it had a minute to live. And hers was the face of one who sees the wave that will drown her already curling overhead, and is past running and only stands. He recovered himself and made her his bow and began, I think, to frame some stiff astonished civility about the strangeness of the meeting, and then his eye fell, as an examining eye must, upon the folio she held, upon the loose leaf of my accounts pinned to it in her hand, her ordinary hand, the round strong upright hand I had watched cross 1,000 pages, and I saw the thought take him. I saw it as one sees the ground open, for he had in his pocket, I learned after, her last letter to him, the cold one, carried there all these weeks against his heart like a stone a man cannot put down, and he drew it out, hardly knowing that he did, and looked from it to the leaf in her hand, and the two hands were one hand and could be no other. And still he'd not understand it, quite, or would not, and he turned to me and asked me, in a voice gone suddenly quiet and careful, whether I would show him the manuscript now. I could not speak. It was she who moved. She set down the folio, and went past me to the counter, and lifted the flap, and knelt and opened the iron box with the little key she had always known where I kept, for she had put the manuscript into it years before with her own hands, and took out the great bound sheaf of it, 400 close pages, the whole architecture of the book, the computations and the trials and the long-hewn argument entire, in one hand from the title to the last, and rose and laid it in his hands herself. "You need not send to the country for the author, your grace," she said. Her voice did not shake. She told me after that she had left off, being afraid somewhere in the last 5 steps, and I believe her, for I heard it. "The author is before you, and has been all summer. My father was a good man and a fair scholar, and he taught me everything I began with, and when his eyes failed he was proud to let me go on past him, and prouder to let the world think the going on was his, because he loved me and knew what the world would do to a woman who owned to such a book. It is mine. Every page you have praised is mine. The mind you honored is mine. I wrote it, and I proved it in your mud, and I am not ashamed of one line of it. I have seen men struck by news of a death take it better." He stood with the weight of it in his 2 hands and turned the leaves one and another, and I watched him lay the cold letter down upon the open page and see the hands merry there under the lamp past all denying, and the blood went out of his face and did not come back. And then I had braced myself for rage, and there was no rage, and that was worse. There came over him a slow settling ruin, as a house settles when the beam is cut, and when he spoke at last it was very low, and it was the low that damned him. For a man may be forgiven what he shouts, and not what he says quietly and means. "All summer," he said, "you let me stand upon that bank and mourn a great man who never was. You took my hand over your own book, and let me tell you what a modest, useful creature you were, your father's copyist, and watched me." He stopped. "I spoke to you of women who write. I sat in that library and told you, to your face, my whole mind of them, the unsexed thing, the garden run to timber, and you sat and heard it, knowing what you were, and let me finish, and told me I was severe. You have made a study of me these 6 months as a man makes a study of a fool. Every kindness I did the daughter was a mockery of the—" and here he used a word I will not set down whole, a word about a mask and a lie, and called it twice a deception, and each time the word fell she stood the straighter under it. "I do not know you," he said. "I looked at you 1,000 times and never once saw you. The woman I esteemed does not exist. You have shown me she never did, and in her place I am asked to." He could not finish it. He looked at her as a man looks at a thing that frightens him, and I saw the whole of chapter and verse of his creed rise up in him and clamp down over the wound like a vice, because it was all he had to hold by, and he said, "I do not know how to reconcile the woman I thought I loved with a woman who could carry a falsehood so long and so well, and smile through it. It is not the cleverness, it is that you could do it. God forgive me, I would rather you had been the copyist." "I know you would," she said. "You have told me so, at more length than this. Upon a wet afternoon I shall remember when I have forgotten my own name. You would rather love a fiction. So did I, for a little while. It is a common weakness. I have given it up." She held out her hand for the manuscript, and after a moment, not knowing what else to do with it, he gave it back to her, and she stood holding all her life against her breast. "You need not fear for your name, your grace. That is what will trouble you tonight, when the first of it has passed, that a duke has been made ridiculous, has crowned a dead man and courted a cheat, and that it will be in the papers and the clubs before the month is out. My sex and my father's grave and your face all dragged through it together. You need fear none of it, because I will spare you the whole. I will write to your society and tell them the truth in 3 lines over my own name, and let them do with it what they please. And I will take back my book out of the honor you would have given it, since the honor was never offered to me, and I will not wear it in a dead man's coat, and I will not have it as your gift. let the medal go where it likes. It was mine before any of you had heard of it, and it will be mine in a garret with my name struck off the cover, and that is more than your esteem was ever worth to me, for your esteem, I have learned, is a thing given to women on the strict condition that they be less than they are. I was more. I am sorry it offends you. I am not sorry I was it. He was silent, and I thought for a moment the thing had gone home, but a creed does not die of one wound, it only bleeds and grows the crueller. He set his hand upon the manuscript she yet held, not to take it, but as a man sets his hand upon a thing he cannot believe is there, and I saw him reckon, against his will, the sheer bulk and labour of it, the years in it, the passionless sustained understanding he had pronounced, upon that very afternoon in his own library, to be the one thing a woman's mind could not compass, and I watched the fact and the creed grind against one another in him and strike no light, only heat. It cannot have cost you nothing, he said low, almost to himself, to make yourself so small so long, and for half a breath there was something in it that was nearly wonder, nearly a grief for her, and then his pride shut over it like water over a stone. For to grant her the book was to grant that he had been wrong not in a small thing, but in the whole settled frame of his understanding, wrong before her, wrong in his own library, wrong in the boast of his reason that was the pride of his life, and that a proud man cannot do at the first asking. Though the proof lie warm in his hands, I do not doubt the book is yours, he said at last, and it was wrung out of him, and it cost him, and it was not mercy but a further cruelty, for he went straight on. That is the whole horror of it to me. I could have borne to find I had praised a lesser man. I cannot yet tell you how it sits with me to have spent a summer schooling the finest understanding in England in its own inferiority, and been thanked for it with a smile. You let me be a fool in my kindness and a brute in my opinions, and never once put out a hand to stop me. That was not the openness I thought lay between us. That was an account kept against me in silence, month upon month, and I do not know how a man is to build anything at all upon a woman who could keep it. You build upon the truth, when at last you are given it, she said, or you build upon nothing, and you have just told me which you had rather have. There is no more to say then, and there was not. He might even then have saved himself and her. I stood at the end of my own counter with my heart going like a boy's and willed it at him across the fog and the lamplight. One word, only turn, only say you spoke in the first shock and did not mean the half. The man is honest, I thought. The man is just. He cannot look at that hand upon that page, 400 pages of a mind he has called the finest of the age, and go on believing that no woman owns such a mind, for the evidence of it is in his very hands and warm from her keeping. But a settled creed in a proud man does not fall at the first blow of the fact. It is the last thing in him to fall long after the reason has gone over, and his pride was flayed raw, and his vanity was in the dust, and he had been, before a tradesman in a shop, unmade. And a man so wounded reaches not for the truth but for the door. He looked at her a long moment, and something moved in his face that might, in a better hour, have been the beginning of the only word that mattered, and he mastered it, because he could not yet bear not to, and he bowed to her. The full grave bow he would have made a duchess, which was somehow the coldest thing of all, and said only, I have wronged your father's memory by doubting it, and I find I have wronged it worse by believing it. I will trouble you no further, Miss Merton. I am sorry to have come. And he went out into the fog, and the bell rang behind him, foolish and small, and we heard his step on the wet stones a little way, and then not at all. She stood where she was until the sound was gone. Then she put the manuscript down very carefully upon the counter, as though it were the thing that could break, and not she, and she said, Well, Mr. Prentice, it is out. I have wanted it out for 2 years, and I did not know it would feel like this. And she smiled at me, a dreadful game little smile, and then her knees gave, and I caught her, and she wept at last, standing up against my old shoulder among the shelves, not for her book, and not for the scandal to come, but only, over and over, that he had said he would rather she had been the copyist. And I could not tell her he had not meant it, because he had, and I held her, and had no comfort in me. And outside the fog came down thicker and put out even the lamp across the way, and it seemed to me that night that the whole cold weight of the world's opinion had won, and honestly won, and that there was no road out of it at all, and that a good man's blindness and a good woman's pride had between them killed the one true thing I had ever been near, and I could not for my life see how it should ever live again. I have said I could not see how it should ever live again, and I set that down honestly, because I would not have you think me one of those chroniclers who, knowing the happy end, sought the dark of the tale with sly winks to keep his reader easy. I did not know the end. I thought it a grave and went about my shop that weep man who has buried something in the cellar and must walk over the spot to sell his books. But I had reckoned without the one quality in the Duke of Wraxby that neither his pride nor his creed could in the long run overrule. And that quality was the very thing she had first admired in him, and I had first mistrusted, the cold merciless honesty of his mind, which could no more leave a false conclusion standing, once the fact was in its hands, than water can be persuaded to run uphill for a gentleman's convenience. For consider what he carried away with him into the fog. He carried the memory of 400 pages in one strong upright hand, the very hand of the cold letter in his breast, and a rational man may bolt from such a proof in the first hour, and slam his creed down over it as I saw him do. But he cannot unknow it, and Edward of Wraxby was above all other things a man who could not unknow. He went back to his own county and his empty great house and the drained shining valley that was her work under his feet wherever he walked in it, and there, alone, through the black end of that November and into December, he did the thing that saved them both, which was simply to stop lying to himself. He has told me since, for he and I are friends now, strange as that word looks on the page, a little of what those weeks were. And I will not spread it out for show. It is enough to say that he took his own creed down off its shelf and examined it, as he would have examined a suspect drainage scheme, for soundness against the evidence, and it did not stand. He had said in his own library to her face that the sustained passionless understanding was the one country of the mind a woman could not enter, and he held in his memory now the sustained passionless understanding entire, 400 pages of it, and knew past cavil whose it was. He had two things before him, and only two, and both could not be Trude, his creed, or Dorothea Merton. One of them was a general proposition he had inherited from his father and his college and the whole loud confident chorus of his age, and had never once in his life put to the proof. And the other was a fact he had walked over with his own boots and praised with his own mouth, and could produce upon demand from an iron box beneath a bookseller's counter. And being the man he was, being, I do him the justice to say, the most honest man of my acquaintance, he did at last what his whole life had trained him to do and his whole pride begged him not. He let the fact stand and struck the creed. He had called her mind the finest of the age when he thought it a man's. The mind had not changed in the night, only his knowing of its owner had changed, and if the praise was true on Tuesday, it was true on Wednesday. Or it had never been praise at all, but only prejudice wearing the coat of judgment. He saw that he had not admired a man and been deceived. He had admired a mind, and admired it rightly, and had then proposed to withdraw the admiration not because the mind had failed, but because it belonged to a woman, which was to say that he had proposed to punish her, precisely, for being the thing he loved. And when a man of that severity of conscience sees that of himself in plain words, he does not comfort himself, he is sick with it. He wrote me afterward, in the one letter of his I have kept apart from all the rest, that he had spent his life priding himself on following the evidence wherever it led, and had discovered at 36 that he had followed it faithfully in every matter except the one where it cost his vanity something, and that a reason so obedient to its master's comfort was not reason at all, but its lackey in a scholar's gown, and that he had behaved, he said, he used the words himself, like a fool and like a coward, a fool to have loved a mind and denied it, a coward to have wounded a woman rather than own that he had been wrong. But it is one thing to be convinced in a cold room alone, and another to pay for the conviction in the daylight before men. And it is here that I honour him most, and here that the tale turns for good, for the scandal had not slept. The grave fellow's doubt had done its work. The county talk had reached the town, and by the turn of the year it was murmured in more than one club that the great Wraxby method was under a cloud, that the author's own papers could not be shown, that the daughter had fled and the Duke gone silent, and that the shrewd would do well to wait before they built a shilling upon a book so oddly vouched. He might have let this run. Had he been the man his creed had made him, he would have. A word from him, and the doubt would have swallowed her whole, buried her book with her father in the general laughter, and left his own name only lightly grazed, the Duke a little too quick to praise no more. These things are forgotten. Her silence had offered him that very road. She had promised, standing white against my shelves, to take the whole weight upon herself and strike her name from the cover and leave him clean. It was the easy way and the coward's way, and it was open to him, and instead he took the other. He came up to London in January, and he did not come first to the shop. He went to the society. He asked Lev to address the fellows upon the doubt that had been cast upon the Merton method, and it was granted him gladly, for they supposed, the whole room supposed, that the Duke of Wraxby was come to crush the impudent question and defend the medal he had championed, and he let them suppose it until he was upon his feet before them all, and then he told them the truth. I was there. She would not go, and I went for her, and stood at the back among the clerks, and I would not have missed it for the remainder of my life. He told them that the doubt was just, that the papers could not be shown in the author's hand, as the world had been given to understand that author, because the world had been given to understand it wrongly, and himself first and most confidently of all. He told them that the Merton method was not the work of the late Mr. Merton save in its first seeds and its schooling, that had been carried to its whole great height, computed, argued, drawn, and at last proved in the field, by Mr. Merton's daughter, Miss Dorothea Merton, alone. That he had had the manuscript entire in his own hands, in her hand throughout, and that he staked his name and his honour, which he begged them to remember he had never before staked lightly, upon her sole authorship. And then, because he knew his own room and knew that some grave head would already be shaping the words a woman, he forestalled it, and gave them the sentence I carried home to her that night through the frost like a live coal in both my hands. He said that he had himself, not a 12 months since and upon that very estate, pronounced this to be no work for a lady, that he had been as wrong as it is given to an educated man to be, that he had said it in the ignorance of his prejudice to the very woman whose work it was, and that she had answered him not by argument, but by draining a valley he had failed for 10 years to drain, and that if any gentleman present wished to hold that a woman could not compass such a labour, the gentleman was welcome to walk the Wraxby marshes in his good boots and explain to the standing corn how it came to be there. There was, I will not pretend otherwise, some laughter, and not all of it kind, and a good part of it turned, as such laughter will, upon the Duke duped, the great improver who had courted a treatise's ghostly author, and been all the while, the wits had it 6 ways before the week was out. He stood and took it. That is the whole of what I can say, and the whole of what needs saying. He stood in his place and took the mockery full in the face, the sniggers and the raised brows and the murmured pleasantries of men not fit to sharpen her pens. And he did not flinch from one particle of it, because he had reckoned the cost before he rose and judged her name worth more than his own dignity, and having so judged, he paid. And a strange thing happened, as it will when one honest man will simply stand and be laughed at for the truth. The laughter found no purchase and began to shame those who made it. The grave fellow who had raised the doubt rose when the Duke had done, and said stiffly that he had asked only for the truth and had received it more amply and more honourably than he had looked for, and that the science was not altered by the sex of the mind that made it, the drained valley being there for any man to walk, and that he for one would see Miss Merton's name upon the work, or he would resign his own place, and the room, which a moment before had been all teeth, turned about as rooms do, and before the evening was out it was no longer a scandal that a woman had written the book but a marvel. And the medal that had been struck for Mr. Merton was, by the spring, struck again for Mr. Merton and his daughter both, her name below his and level with it, in the plain letters she had earned in the mud, and her father's memory set right in the same stroke. Honoured now for the true and generous thing he had done, which was to shelter a genius the world would have crushed, until it could stand in its own name. He came to the shop the next morning. I had told her what he had done. I could not have kept it if my life hung on it, and I would not have kept it for the world, and so she knew, when the bell went and I drew back into the store-room and left the front to the two of them, that the man in the doorway was not the man who had gone out into the fog. I did not hear the whole of it, and would not set it here entire if I had, for some ground is too near sacred even for a gossiping old bookseller to tread in print. But the door between was thin, and I am not a saint, and I heard enough, and she gave me the rest herself in the years we had after to grow easy in the telling of it. He did not come to forgive her. I want that understood, for it is the pith of the man's whole change. He did not come as a lesser and commoner sort of proud man comes, to grant a gracious pardon for the deception and expect to be thanked and taken. He came to ask her pardon. He stood in my shop and laid his pride down on the counter between them like a thing he had done with, and told her he had been wrong, not delicately, not with the half wrong that saves a corner of one's vanity, but wholly and to the root wrong in his creed, wrong in his library, wrong in the fog, wrong in every settled certainty of his life that had stood between his eyes and her. He told her that he had loved her mind before ever he knew it was a woman's, and that he loved it now not less for the knowing but immeasurably the more, because he saw at last what it had cost her to make so great a thing in secret, and carry it so long unpraised, and let a foolish man lecture her upon her own inferiority and never once strike him for it. And that a courage of that order was a part of the mind he had admired and not a thing apart from it. He told her he did not want a helpmeet, and did not want an echo and would be wretched with either, that he wanted an equal and a rival, and a partner to quarrel with over the drawings until midnight, that he asked her not to be one grain less than she was, but to be openly and in the sight of all England and under her own name for as long as they both should live, the whole of it. And then she told me this part with her eyes bright, years on, and I will keep it as she gave it. He took back, kneeling on the floor of my poor shop among the dust and the ledgers, the very words with which the tale began. This, he had said upon a bank in summer, is no work for a lady. He said now that he had never in his life spoken words that shamed him more or that he was gladder to unsay, that it was work for precisely one lady of his acquaintance, and for no man he had ever met including himself, and that he begged the lady in question, who had done the work, to do him the further and wholly unmerited honour of doing it henceforward as his wife. She did not fall into his arms. I could have told him she would not, and I dare say he had learned it and loved her the better for it. She was not to be flattered, and she was not to be bought, and she said so, standing over him with her hand not yet given, that fine speeches were cheap, and that she had heard him make a cruel one very fluently in that same voice, and that she would not have him if his coming were only a generous man's remorse dressed up as love, for she had had enough of being a duty. But she had seen what he did at the society. She had it from me an hour after it was done, and there is no flattery in that, and no buying, only man staking the thing he prized most in the world, his own consequence, publicly and at a dead loss, to set her name where it belonged. That was not words. That was the evidence of the man, laid on the table as she had laid her manuscript, and she was, as he was, a follower of evidence to the end. She looked at it, and she looked at him, and she found the account square at last, and she gave him her hand and chose him freely and with her eyes open, as an equal chooses, her mind her own, her name her own, and neither of them any longer a thing she would hold behind her back. What passed in the next quarter hour behind that thin door is theirs, and I mended a great many pens that did not need mending, and was happier than I have words even now to render. They were married in the spring quietly, in the county whose marshes she had drained, and I gave her away, there being no one else, and cried like a fool and was glad to. She was the Duke of Wraxby's Duchess before the county and the world, but the thing I hold to, the thing I set this whole long history down to say, is that she was, from that spring forward, Dorothea Merton upon the title page of every work she gave the world, and there were many, and they grew greater, and he laboured at her side upon them and gloried in being, as he said, the second best mind in his own house, and the luckiest man in England to be beaten under his own roof each night before the fire. The hidden authoress signed her own name until she was an old woman full of years and honour, and he lived to see it, and to see the young men of the society quote her as their masters had once quoted her father, and never once did I hear him repeat the sentence he had knelt to unsay, save once at their own table, when some visiting fool of a young lord let it fall that natural philosophy was no study for a woman, and the Duke set down his glass and said, very mild, that he had held that opinion himself once, and that it had cost him very nearly the whole of his happiness and the best summer of his life, and that he could recommend the giving of it up to any gentleman who valued either. And his Duchess laughed down the table at him, and he at her, and I, an old man by then and near the end of my visiting, thought that I had lived long enough, for this is the whole of it, and I am done. The most rational nobleman in England prided himself that he followed the evidence wherever it led, was taught the one limit of his reason by the finest mind he ever knew, that a man's reason will serve any master, even his own vanity, until an honest heart compels it straight, and having been taught it, and being at bottom too honest to refuse the lesson though it flayed him, he had the great good sense and the greater good luck to marry the teacher, he said, that first bright day upon the bank, not knowing the work was hers, that this was no work for a lady. He was right, as it fell out in a way he never dreamed, for it was no work for a lady, nor for a lord, nor for any common soul of either sex under heaven. It was work for Dorothy Merton, who did it, and I, who kept her secret, have now told it whole, and may down my pen content,